mic so that we can do that. And I guess I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for the day. Paola Espitia is making a media that moves. For 2 decades, she has worked to understand and conserve coral reef ecosystems as a marine biologist. But when she realized she could make a bigger impact for the ocean through storytelling, she became a speaker for sea cruising over 20,000 miles aboard world-class cruise lines, educating thousands of people about ocean conservation. Today, she's a naturalist aboard the National Geographic fleet of expedition ships. Paola also co-leads the Ola'pi Creative, a media production studio based in Florida's Space Coast. As a media impact producer and strategist, she has skillfully merged the fields of marketing, conservation, to help organizations motivate meaningful action through production of video content and engaging bilingual communication campaigns. However, her biggest contributions toward a better, bluer future is raising an outdoor-loving son. Paola holds a Master's of Science degree from Nova Southeastern University at Halmos College of Arts and Sciences, and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Delaware. Thank you very much for being here. I look forward to learning more about water and everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about messing up the names.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. How are you today? Well, you're about to feel that much better. Thank you all so much for joining me. My name is Paola Espitia, and I am the co-creator of Ola'pi Creative, which is a media agency based here in the Barrier Islands of the Space Coast. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that you're not accustomed to hearing about in this particular setting, but I think you're going to find it very useful and important when it comes to promoting more conservation of our natural resources. Now, to start off, I'd like to go ahead and go to the first slide. There it is. Now let's just take a few moments to really sit back, get comfortable in your seats, and let's just gaze off into the ocean. Don't have to think about anything, just listen to the waves and allow the view to drift you off. Now that is a really good sound, isn't it? What's a word you would use to describe how you feel when you get a chance to spend time by water? Anybody want to share? Calm. Calm. Mm-hmm. What else? Soothing. Mm-hmm. Peaceful. All of that. Now, my next question is, who here has been to space? I'm really excited for the day that I meet an astronaut because we're so close. I feel like I'm getting closer and closer to meeting an astronaut. Well, for those of us who have yet to go to space, this, of course, is what our planet looks like from the inky vastness of the universe. We actually look a lot like this blue marble. And it just so turns out that when astronauts go off to space and they get to look back at our planet, they come back with an incredibly different perspective. And part of that perspective is the fact that we are 71% covered by ocean. And of course, there's a real reason why we're so drawn to water. And a lot of that has to do with the facts of this blue water that we have on our planet. In fact, astronauts, or when NASA is looking for life on other planets, they oftentimes use the moniker that they're looking for water. And of course, why wouldn't they be looking for water? Water is the very source of life. And here on our own planet, we're actually finding that water is incredibly valuable, not only in our everyday lives, but for global economies. For instance, 3/4 of the world's population actually earns some kind of income from water-based sources. 500 million of us rely on proteins that come from water. Even in our everyday lives, each one of us here in the United States uses anywhere between 80 to 100 gallons of water for our daily needs every single day. And so, of course, there is this real draw to water, but it actually goes much deeper than that. You see, there's about 60% of us on this planet actually live within 60 miles of an ocean, lake, or river. So how many for you is that true? Raise your hand if you live within 60 miles of a coastline. All of us. So especially here in the state of Florida, 76% of our population lives near some kind of coast. And our state of Florida has the second most amount of coastline behind the state of Alaska. So we truly are a state that is very much water focused. And yet we seem to have kind of lost that connection to water. In fact, what we see now is that there's a science writer named Lauren Isley, and the way she describes us is that we are just bodies going about a way that water has going beyond the reaches of rivers. And so it turns out that our connection to water runs much more deeply than simply proximity, food, and economy. We, of course, came from water originally for swimming, crawling, and then walking. But in our modern lifestyles, we have actually become very much disconnected to water. You can change the slide, please. There we go. In our modern day lifestyles, we've actually become very much disconnected from water. And, if you think about it, we spend a lot of time in artificial spaces, breathing artificial air. We are driving in vehicles that are man-made on man-made roads. We're walking on asphalt. A lot of the cleaning products we use, even perfumes, are made to mimic the smells of nature, but in fact are all artificial. And even our touch, even the things that we touch, the surfaces, of course, our phones, are all man-made. And so because of our modern day lifestyles, we've actually become very disconnected from the very sense that we are supposed to be, using these senses for, and that is to really become much more closely interactive with the natural world. And it turns out it is killing us. We have unknowingly developed what we're calling a red mind of stress. And this stress is actually becoming a chronic issue for us, causing lots of illnesses, disease, PTSD. I mean, in fact, we're actually even over-relying on drugs and alcohol to calm us down because we're so overstimulated by all of these artificial substances and surfaces and environments that we really have lost sight of what it really truly means to be connected to nature. But what if I were to tell you that instead of being prescribed more medications, we could actually look to water as a source of healing? What if I were to tell you that simply by going kayaking or spending a day looking out on the water can actually help to more immediately and more long-lasting help you to recover from those ailments? And all it would take is just simply spending more intentional time by water. Well, it turns out that there is a new field of science known as blue mind science. And what blue mind science is showing us is that we have this innate connection to water, and it's actually helping us to promote this calm, connected feeling to our natural environment, but in a very different way than forest bathing, for instance, in a very different way from green spaces. So our blue mind is actually the source, perhaps, of how we could be better feeling, how we could become more creative, happier, calmer, and more connected in our modern day. So I'll take you to that spot. Maybe you were there this morning in the shower. Of course, I'm sure many of you have had an aha moment in the shower. That's usually where a moment of genius comes out. And there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, when we're in the shower, we actually go into this drift mode. And as we're feeling the water flow over our heads, our brains actually start to let go of our everyday worries. Even, you're not thinking so much about what am I having for breakfast? Who do I have to call? What kind of appointments do I have to go to later in the day? Instead, when we're in the shower, we actually have this moment to ourselves, and our brains slip into this drift mode where we're actually creating much more creative connections to our synapses. And because of that, that is when we're not thinking about it, that's exactly when we have the aha moment. So you have experienced it. Little did you know, you too have experienced this blue mind state. And it's a very important thing to note, because it turns out that the more that we can harness just feeling good and being in the shower, for instance, the better the rest of our day will become and the better our lives will come. The other thing to note, of course, is that the real benefit of being on water and being in the shower is that we are disconnected from the cell phones and from the laptops that really draw away our attention. So next time you're in the shower, don't think about breakfast. Don't think about your appointments later in the day or who you may have to call. I invite you to simply take a shower, and then you too will find more moments of genius come to you. So let's understand more. So why is it that these aha moments come to us in the shower? Well, for one, I can tell you it has everything to do with our senses. You see, water has this really beautiful ability to put us in a very deep, relaxed state. And one of the reasons is because, of course, the sight of water. How many of you love the color blue? I love the color blue. Look at me, I'm wearing blue. Everything is blue. This is my life, it's blue. Well, it turns out that blue is the world's favorite color, and that's no coincidence. A lot of these colors actually come with some kind of psychological significance. And the color blue helps to promote calm and trust. And in fact, a lot of times we'll see hospital rooms painted in this color blue. Even this is painted in the color blue to promote calm and trust. The other thing that blue does for us is it actually helps to evoke this sense not only of calm, but of also surrender. When we especially can have a clear vista, like when we're looking out in the ocean or looking at these great expanses here in the Indian River Lagoon, we are actually able to give our brains a break from having to process our modern lifestyles, from having to process the billboards, the buildings, the cars all around us, the people shuffling by. Well, it turns out when we can have a clear vista, not only does our brain take a break from having to process that information, but it also allows us to go back into our ancestral roots and see that there's no danger coming. We feel calm when we have these vistas because it allows us to actually have that sense. So when we don't see danger coming, that's because that allows us to calm down. The other neat thing about the color blue, it turns out that a couple of years ago, every year Crayola Crayon comes up with a brand new color of the year. And 2 years ago, the color of the year was the color Bluetiful. And even Pantone also comes up with its colors of the year. Last year, it was True Blue. The year before, it was Coral, which I love too as a former coral scientist. And so it turns out that we really are not just drawn to the color blue, but also drawn to the open wide vistas that looking out the ocean provides us. The other thing that happens when we're around water is that the sound of water is really inviting for us. And in fact, you can say that the sound of water is literally the soundtrack of relaxation. It's either running water, a waterfall, rainfall, ocean waves. All of those sounds just automatically help us to calm down. And in fact, your breath rate slows when you're hearing these sounds. And as your breath rate slows, so too does your heart rate. And so everything immediately gets in alignment to put you into this calm, centered state, your blue mind state. The other thing that maybe you haven't thought about when you're listening to the sound of water, or even if you're walking down by the beach, is the fact that when you're around these sounds of water, it actually provides this really neat bubble of privacy. And so if you're walking with somebody who you care about, or even a neighbor, it allows you a really intimate moment to be able to open up because you're in that somewhat of a privacy bubble. So next time you are down by running water, whether it's the beach, whether it's a fountain somewhere, really take that time to connect more deeply with the people that you're with, because you are in that privacy bubble. The other element of water is, of course, the next slide, which is, there it is, smell. I call it smell, but the reality is that when you are around running water, whether it's crashing ocean waves or whether it's a waterfall, there's actually a lot of negative ions in the air. And those negative ions help our brains to release serotonin, the happy chemical. And so taking in this big, deep breath of salt water or of the water from waterfalls actually helps our brains release serotonin, helping to alleviate depression, helping to relieve the symptoms of PTSD, and it actually can help to boost your daytime energy. And so next time you want to take a nap, maybe instead of taking a nap, go down to the beach, go for a walk, and take in some nice, big, deep breaths. You might be surprised at how energized you feel after that. Then there is the touch of water. Are there any scuba divers in the room? Oh my, like practically everybody here is a scuba diver. Okay, so somebody, what does it feel like when you're scuba diving? Who wants to share?
Like another world.
It's another world. And when you're underwater, what does that feel like?
Weight.
Complete weightlessness. And there's no other place on our planet where we get to experience life like the astronauts do, a life without gravity. And being in water, submerged in this way, as you are completely submerged when you're scuba diving, or even simply floating, affords us this really beautiful experience. Because little do we know, just simply sitting here in our seats or standing around actually requires thousands of micro muscles and tiny movements to keep our bodies upright. And so it's not until we step into water that we finally get the relief from everyday gravity of our planet. So water affords us this extra feeling of weightlessness that we don't get when we're simply walking through a forest, or like I call green spaces. The other thing that's really special about being in blue spaces is that they help to promote awe. And it turns out that when we're in places of these wild, beautiful spots, or even, down here at the Indian River Lagoon, we get a chance to be so immersed in nature. And it reminds us of just how incredibly lucky we are to live on the one planet where, so far that we know, happens to have water and is giving us this life and giving us the oxygen we breathe. In fact, everybody take a deep breath. Now take a second deep breath. We can thank ocean plankton for that second deep breath. And so when we are in these special places around water, these are things that we can reflect on. And not to mention that when you're in the state of awe that you are in when you're in blue spaces, it also helps you to remember purpose. And those of us who have purpose in life will live 7 to 10 years longer than our friends who don't. So it turns out that really being in these kinds of spaces is extraordinarily important. And again, especially in our modern lifestyles, where oftentimes when we are in watery spaces, we actually don't have our phones with us. And again, that is the big relief that water provides us. So this is all of the sensory pieces that come into play when we talk about blue mind science. And you can actually learn more about it from Dr. Wallace J. Nichols. He's a marine biologist whose focus is on sea turtles. And he's also a surfer, and he was starting to question, how come all of us marine scientists and surfers are just so happy? And what is it about us? Are we something special? Are we something extraordinary? Well, no, it just turns out that we know a little bit more about how we feel when we're in water. And so he started teaming up with neuroscientists to better understand what is this connection and what is actually happening, and why do so many of us feel the same, even if we may just be walking on the beach, scuba diving, kayaking, surfing giant waves. It doesn't matter what you're doing. But if you spend time in, on, under, and near water, it turns out that you can live a calmer, happier, more creative, more fulfilled, and more significant life. And the more that we can embrace that, the more that we will remember exactly what it is that these water spaces, these blue spaces are gifting us. So I invite you all to definitely check out this book to learn more about the science behind blue minds. And it really will resonate with you, because again, oftentimes when we talk to people, You know, I also lead kayak tours when I'm on the ships, National Geographic. It's such a wonderful place to be, of course, because I'm around interesting people. But more importantly, I get to sleep on the water, talk about the water with people who like the water. And it's a really amazing experience. But it's when we start talking about, you know, we all have the same feelings about water, but when we talk about the science behind it, is when we realize that this is something real. And it's not just emotions and feelings, fluffy, fluffy. We can actually put a lot of science behind it. And this is very significant. And so this is why I wanted to start this presentation today with the science behind the feeling that you get when you're on water. Because feelings and emotions are oftentimes not spoken about in science, but it's what we're lacking in our science and our conservation efforts. Because in order to move people to take action for conservation, we need to first tap into their emotions. I love this quote by Dr. Wallace J. Nichols because it perfectly describes what I was just saying. Blue Mind gives us a frame to talk about intangible values for one of the feelings that makes life worth living. And so thank you to him and the science the collaborative science that he's coming up with. We now have a way to better describe this. So now that we know a little bit more about the science behind how good we feel around water, well, let's try to understand how can we actually harness this Blue Mind science to motivate change. That's what we're here to do. For so long, we have talked about the ecological significance of our waterways. We've talked about the economic significance of waterways, but we never bring up the emotional value of waterways. And so now we have a tool to help us talk about that in a way that's still backed by science, in a way that maybe other people will hear us. So how do we motivate change? Well, in this talk, you're going to learn how to become a better storyteller, because when you can tell a good story, that's when you connect. So to give you an idea of just how powerful storytelling is, I'm sure many of you are amazing storytellers. And, you know, oftentimes, if you want to hear a really good story, talk to the people who work in the field, talk to park rangers, talk to marine biologists. I mean, the more time you spend out there in the field, the more crazy your stories may become because you have had a lot of experience and it's very unpredictable. But these are amazing storytellers. And one of the neat things about being a storyteller is that it also actually helps you become a really effective leader, because people will not listen to leaders they will not follow. They cannot follow. They listen to leaders who can speak concisely, clearly, present a problem, but more importantly, present the solution. And so if you can do so using story, then you become a better leader and more people will listen to you and will want to do the change that you're asking them to make. The other powerful tool, the powerful thing that happens with story is that it promotes, of course, a lot of engagement. And this is a very difficult thing a lot of times for scientists to do, is be very engaging, because we're very good at being data-driven and looking at the stats and presenting the numbers. But in reality, we need to be moving beyond the statistics, beyond the facts, and be connecting with people more deeply. Story affords us the opportunity to be liked, trusted, and supported. And that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to have this science supported. Story, of course, promotes connection. This is how we relate to one another. This becomes really important too, because oftentimes, you know, I have a feeling I'm speaking to a lot of people in the room who probably understand what I understand and believe what I understand too, believe what I believe. But what we really need to be doing is not just talking to the inner circle, but also trying to reach those in the outer circle. And so story really helps you to connect with people who may not have the same background as you, who may not be coming from the same perspective as you. But when we use story, we promote understanding and support. And when you can get support from everybody in the community, from all of the stakeholders, and not just the citizens who care, suddenly we're talking about real change. Suddenly we're talking about everybody being on board and that support really coming through. And the other thing that story affords us is the opportunity to be very current in the way that people want to be talked at, essentially. Right now, you know, especially because of Zoom and because of our experiences with COVID, we really lost the opportunity to be able to be face-to-face. And of course, if we're face-to-face, we have a great opportunity to connect and engage, and it's wonderful. but it's very difficult to engage through video, through the computer. But yet, when we use story, we can actually do that. And it is really the current way that people are looking to get information. People are looking for content that is educational, hopeful, positive, and current. And so using story, speaking in this way, truly is the way that we can connect currently in this modern day and age. So why does story work so well? Well, let's go back to the science, right? Right here, you're looking at an image of a brain scan of somebody who's being told 3 different narratives. The image on the far left is of the brain of somebody who's being told a story full of narrative and complexity, whereas the image on the far right is of somebody who's being told simply facts and statistics. As you can see, the image on the far left is brilliant. Colors are everywhere. There's so much of the brain is being activated. And you know what happens when we speak in story? Story allows us to bring in details and emotional components, and our brain gets lit up. More parts of our brain get lit up. And in this way, actually, because we're engaging so many different pieces of our brains remember what we're being told. The person there on the far left, poor thing, they have no idea what they're being told. Sure, maybe like a little data blank came up, but they're probably going to forget that information not too long after. And so the other powerful piece about story is that it helps us not just connect, engage, show leadership, and be current, but it really helps us to deliver information in a way that will be memorable. And when what you're saying is memorable, then you have an opportunity to share that and become a teacher for those around you. This is not just about, only the scientists are allowed to talk about the importance, the significance of the Indian River Lagoon. The Indian River Lagoon affects all of us. And so we all have an opportunity to use our voice and to talk about our own experiences with the lagoon and how it's made us feel. And when you speak in story, rather than just facts, you become memorable and you can really rally that support around your message. So that's a really neat piece about story. And it's all in science. We can see it right here. So we are about to learn the simplest way to tell a story. And I promise you're not going to forget because it's only 3 words. This is considered the ABT storytelling framework. And this was developed actually by a marine scientist who turned into a movie producer, Dr. Randy Olson. He also has a number of books if you're interested in learning more about how to use science or story in science. One of his books is called Don't Be Such a Scientist. Another book that he's written is Houston, We Have a Narrative. So he has a really great way of delivering information. But it's very interesting that as he was going to movie school over in LA, he suddenly realized that there's a reason why these blockbuster movies are such a hit. And although there are very complex frameworks that describe why story works, it turns out that when you boil it all down, you can boil it down to 3 simple words: and, but, and therefore. If I had a microphone, I would drop it. That's it. You can go home. There's nothing else to learn. No, really. It's so simple. It's so, so simple. And is the start of our story. And it's just where we can actually create the scene, and is what answers the what and the so what. And this becomes a very important piece because especially when we're speaking to people who are in the outer circle, one of the first things that we want to do is set up connection, and we want to set up a sense of unity. And when you can start your story in this way, describing what, and then immediately answering the so what, because people, especially in the outer circle, are going to say, well, why should I listen to you? So what? What does that matter to me? Well, the word and helps to connect those 2 points. And so it helps to establish a meeting point. And again, this is very important too when we're talking to people in the outer circle. We want to say, look, people like us do things like this. This is actually a very interesting way to start off stories or to talk about, science, for instance, because oftentimes in marketing, they talk more so about present the problem, agitate the problem, and then your product is the solution. But if we present a problem to a room of people who don't experience that problem, well, then they stop listening, they tune out, and they move on. And so if we can start the story instead with what's and so what's, and start with a very general phrase, then we're able to set up agreement. And people more so listen in that sense. Then comes the but. So and sets up agreement, but sets up the problem. There is no story until something happens. But although it's only 3 little words, it's probably one of the most important words in our vocabulary because it's only 3 letters, but it's only very important in our vocabulary because when you think about feedback that you receive, oftentimes, oh, this wonderful things, and then somebody throws in a but you could have done better. Guess what you're going to bed at night listening to? Oh, done better. I didn't know. Like, no, it's wonderful compliments you received ahead of time. It was what happened after but is what sinks in, what you remember. And so the word but becomes extremely important, especially as we talk about story. Because again, story does not become a story until something happens. And then finally, we need to set up a resolution. The word therefore or so presents the resolution to that problem. And so it makes sense of the new scenario. What we're trying to do when we're talking to people, especially when it comes to conservation, when it comes to caring for our natural resources, we want to set up agreements, we want to set up the problem, but in order for our brains to continue following what the message is, we have to have the resolution. And the word therefore is the guide, the transition that helps us set up the resolution. This, when you speak in this way, it really helps for people to stay tuned in to what it is that you're talking about. And oftentimes, you'll even see it at maybe some other presentations, science-based presentations can be very dry. And it's too bad because the science is really good. But oftentimes you'll hear scientists stand up on stage and say, and I did this, and we're looking at this, and this is how, and here are the results, and here's the discussion, and we need to do more work. It's typically how those presentations go. But when we can speak more so using this phrasing and button therefore, it actually allows our brains a very familiar framework to follow, and we stay tuned in and engaged, and we remember, and then we pass it on. That's the difference. So when we break it down, a conversational and concise story is simply something and something, but blank, therefore blank. Pretty easy. We can all probably come up with a very concise conversational story right now at this moment. But, well, let me provide an example for you. This is how a very simple story may sound like. There's an estuary in my backyard known as the Indian River Lagoon, and it's an incredible natural treasure, but its health is suffering. Therefore, my community is coming together to save the Indian River Lagoon. Sounds good? Everything makes a lot of sense, right? That's actually a very good elevator pitch right there. You can take a picture of that and share that with all of your friends, although they probably already know that story. Like I said, it just takes a minute to learn, but I promise it takes a lifetime to master speaking in this way. So now that we've had an introduction to what story could look like, let's actually further develop it. This is what we call the story circle. Let's go back to not the end, but the beginning, where the writer, the beginning is what the writer throws away. So we must first go to the buts. The buts, again, is the most important piece of our story. The buts, there's no story until something happens. So when we go back to actually revisit the buts, it's important that we understand what is it that we're actually trying to communicate. So I rewrote the buts to go from, but its health is suffering, to, but over time, we've lost sight of this natural treasure, leaving the lagoon unhealthy and unappreciated. You see how that sounds a little bit different? There's a little bit more going on in this phrasing. And the reason why this works a little bit better is because of a couple points. One is that it's a singular narrative. Our big issue in science communication and storytelling oftentimes is that we tend to bring up too many issues. We tend to bring up all of the issues. And it's true. The lagoon has suffered because of 1,000 cuts, but we cannot be speaking about every single one of those in order for people to take action because they get overwhelmed and then nothing happens at all. So if you really want to tell a good story, if you really want to be a good communicator for conservation, pick one thing, pick one problem and focus your narrative around one problem. The other thing that's an interesting point that becomes, it's a little complex, but you can do it, is considering the framing behind that problem. So is the problem at the local level? Locals, keep throwing the trash in the lagoon. It's a local problem. Is the problem a state level problem? Is the problem because of policy changes? Is the problem national? Is it even because of something global like climate change? So the framing of where that problem comes from is going to be extremely important. And the problem could even be that you simply want your lagoon, you need to go seek therapy because you're too depressed. The lagoon has failed you in a sense. That becomes a very personal problem then. And so the framing of your narrative and your story becomes really important here. And it takes a lot of consideration. But when you get the framing right, then you know exactly who you're targeting. You know exactly where to go to find the solution. Local, state, national, global, it's up to you. Personal, it's up to you. Now, a neat thing, you can boil all this down into but the one problem. So now that we have figured out the buts, the big problem, we go back to the beginning and we make sure that our introduction, the and piece, is actually relating to the problem. So I actually rewrote the and to say this. There's an estuary in my backyard known as the Indian River Lagoon that generates $7.6 billion a year in local revenue. And if we can prevent it from becoming polluted, then we can look forward to greater long-lasting benefits to our local ecosystems, economies, and enjoyment. Now, it definitely sounds more robust than I have this lagoon in my backyard, and it's a national treasure. Now, when we revisit the and, it's important as we're writing this piece that we want to make sure that we're setting up the scene. Again, this is the piece where we want to make sure that we're being very general. It's very difficult. You'll read scientific papers and oftentimes they are talking, they're so zoomed out. Every single, for instance, in the coral community, single abstract starts with, coral reefs are declining around the world. Like every single one starts like that. And it's like, okay, well, can we get beyond that now? But here, we want to set up the scene, but we're doing it in a way that's a little bit different because, again, this is not what we're talking about a problem. What makes this particular piece work is that we're talking very generally. And so nobody can argue in the fact that there's an estuary and it has a lot of money involved in it. And it's, it's a national treasure. Everybody can agree that those are things. The other thing that works really well with this particular version of the story is that it also helps to answer the so what. So after you have the first statement, which is the general agreement, then you have the word and then the next statement answers the so what. Because especially people who may not be on board quite yet are going to immediately want to know, what does this have to do with me? Well, boom, you're able to answer it right there in that next statement. The other thing that's really important here in the very beginning of any of your stories and statements is that there is no problem. Again, we are not talking about the traditional rules of marketing. We are now talking about conservation marketing. And in conservation marketing, we want to set up agreement. We do not want to alienate people who do not have the same problems as we do because then they just drop off and they don't listen anymore. And so there are no problems here. These are just simply facts in a way. The other piece that makes this supercharged are two words, utilizing the words if and then. When we throw in the words if and then, as we did here, and if we can prevent it from being polluted, then we can enjoy long-lasting benefits. When you use those two words, it actually helps to increase the stakes. It really shows that if this happens, then this. And so this particular and statement becomes very powerful, not only because we're using the if then, we're showing what happens when we do take action. It also has that little bit of a detail with the dollar amounts. As much as I have struggled all my career to help people to understand conservation, why they shouldn't litter, why they need to recycle, all of these things. That just doesn't resonate with everybody. But oftentimes when you throw in an economic component, suddenly people start to perk up. And especially when we're talking about in the billions of dollars, suddenly this becomes a very important piece. And adding the if-then helps to increase the stakes. So now our evolved beginning to our story becomes blank. You're just describing the ordinary world. It's something, then something, which would answer the so what piece, getting ahead of what your audience will already be questioning in their heads. Now, the power of storytelling truly rests in the specifics. And a great place to add specifics is in the therefore. So here's how I rewrote the therefore. Therefore, we are radically changing the way we value the Indian River Lagoon to not only include its ecological and economic benefits, but also the emotional benefits of healthy, wild blue spaces. And again, the reason why this works is because we are already answering the so what, and we talk about the power in the specifics, which is talking about, how can you wrap this up in a way that does include more specific details. Another pro tip here when you are writing is that oftentimes, for instance, in science communication, we talk a lot more about how we're doing something and then why it matters. But it turns out that in journalism, they phrase things differently. In journalism, they actually start with what and then how. The reason for that is because when you can deliver the what's right off the bats, then people will stay engaged. They will read, they will listen, they will watch you longer in order to find out how you're doing that. So these simple switches in the way that we phrase our sentences and the way that we storytell actually becomes very significant, and especially when we're talking about reaching those in the outer circle and reaching those who may not know the message quite yet. So therefore simply becomes therefore, and then just structure it with what and then how. So what we started with is blank and blank, but blank, therefore blank. Nice, conversational, concise, evolves into this. The ordinary world is what you present at first. Then you present the what's at stake with the if-then statement. Then you provide the problem after the buts. And finally, you relieve that tension using the word therefore or so in order to give your brain the solution that it's looking for. But you phrase it, what, how. That's it, right? So simple. So now our very tiny little statement from the beginning is transformed into this much more powerful statement. There is an estuary in my backyard known as the Indian River Lagoon that generates $7.6 billion a year in local revenue. And if we can prevent it from being polluted, then we can look forward to greater long-lasting benefits to our local ecosystems, economies, and enjoyment. But over time, we've lost sight of this natural treasure, leaving the lagoon unhealthy and unappreciated. Therefore, we are radically changing the way we value the Indian River Lagoon to not only include ecological and economic benefits, but also the emotional benefits of healthy, wild blue spaces. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? And it wasn't that hard. We just had to simply implement that framework and then use the story circle to rework it. So this is the real screenshot you all need to take. Take the screenshot now, because this gives you all, this is the cheat sheet for how to become an incredible conservation marketer, an incredible storyteller for the wild. At the end of the day, we start with buts. We define the one problem that we're going to talk about. An interesting point about that is that now you're thinking, well, how else am I going to address the thousands of other pieces that are impacting the lagoon? Well, you come up with 1,000 versions of the story. It's an interesting thing to consider because every person that you speak with is going to have a different point of connection. And so it is important to understand what kinds of story, what topics you may be able to share with different people. People who live further inland, closer to Orlando, you may talk to them very differently about the Indian River Lagoon as compared to those of us who live here over on the Barrier Island. And so it's important to have those extra little bits of stories there in your back pocket. We then want to make sure that we have the framing of the problem correct. Is it personal? Is it global? We want to write a simple ABT. This is a really great sample example to follow. There is a thing, and it needs to be better because if X is done, then the thing will be better. But it's not being done, and therefore we're doing this so that X can be better. See how that makes sense? You can just simply fill in the blanks and make a really good, strong connection with people about the true problems with the Indian River Lagoon. We then want to build strong moments using that what, how structure that's being used in journalism. And then we go back with the story circle and we fill in the ands to make sure that we're using compelling details to answer the what's and so what's to create agreement before we dive into the problem and solution. So that is a really basic summary of a very complex ancestral way of communicating that's actually very powerful. And as we saw with the MRI scan, it turns out that when we speak in this way, more people will listen, more people will remember, and more people will share what it is we have to say. And that's the important piece. So next time you're hearing yet another doom and gloom story about the ailing health of the Indian River Lagoon, I know that you probably may be thinking, but what more can I do? I feel like I'm doing everything I can. Where is there room for more? You may start feeling hopeless. But I want you to remember one thing. Moving people is hard, but it doesn't have to be. All you have to do is become a good storyteller. And now that you have these tools in your back pockets, understanding or knowing about blue mind science, feeling how great you feel when you're around water, and then sharing stories around that using this ABT structure. Now that you have all of those in your back pocket, all those tools in your back pocket, I believe that you'll become excellent wave makers, change agents, people who are really going to help us progress towards the development of better conservation stories so that we can make sure that we are empowering the stewards of the Indian River Lagoon. We are also immobilizing more people in our community. And at the end of the day, hopefully, the aim is that we can become the wave makers who can make the restoration of the Indian River Lagoon as great as the watershed itself. So with that, thank you, and I wish you water. Thank you. Would you like any feedback? Would you like to share your own personal water stories? I have a couple.
I know why we're blue.
That's right. Now it all makes sense. You're so beautiful.
Back to the completed example.
Yes, there it is.
Look fantastic.
Mhm. Good. So who would have thought that, simply by, we never assume that there's going to be room for story in science, but it turns out there's a lot of room for story in science. And again, it's all about how can we become better communicators, because that has become the big disconnect, is that so many people are seeing science, talking the jargon, too technical, and so then they drop off. So this really truly is about connection. And now you have this really great way. It's not only connects using story, but now we can also share the blue mind science piece, because we all share that feeling. We moved here for a reason. Let's not forget that piece. And, shameless plug here, on April 15th, I'm actually going to be leading a kayak tour over to the Spoil Islands to do a paddle pickup. And so I invite you to join me for that. I'm happy to share the information about that with you. And the idea is that, we're not just going to talk about all the good things we can do. This will give you an opportunity to actually come with me and let's go experience the things, experience the Spoil Islands, do our good part for the environment, do a little pickup. We're going to explore the Spoil Islands and learn a little bit more about the geography and the biology of those areas. And it's going to be a beautiful day out in the water, practicing Blue Mind. And so you're all welcome to join me for that. Well, thank you all for being here. Yes, please.
Early in the presentation, talking as you were breaking down the concept of and, you said, no problem, Mon. But I read your and it says, if we can prevent it from becoming polluted, and I hear a problem.
So here's an interesting thing about the if then. I'm personally a very positive, optimistic person. Interestingly, though, when you give people a scenario where they will either gain $1,000 or lose $1,000, they will act if they have to lose $1,000. They will do something to change that. And so it's an interesting point because we typically talk about all of the positive things. If we band together, then we can protect the lagoon. Well, that's great. But you'll actually get better results and more action if you talk about what you will lose, because FOMO, fear of missing out, is truly a real thing. And so when we actually talk about the psychology of wording, phrasing things in a way that presents what people will lose will motivate them to act more so than if we phrase things in a way of what people will gain. It's sad, but it's a really important piece to understand. And it's also part of, marketing, advertising. The science of persuasion is a whole nother conversation that we haven't ever really used in conservation action. But when we can look into advertising and marketing and understand what they're doing and how they're getting us to buy the Coca-Cola, we can suddenly then apply to the conservation. And so that became the difference there. So I appreciate you pointing that out. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have a general 2 questions.
Yes, please.
The 1,000 cuts that
Yeah.
you were talking about. So what you're advising is there are a lot of groups that are working in the conservation world. And what you advise is you could apply this formula to something very specific if they want. So if they want to talk about septic tanks, then they apply this formula to just the septic tank issue.
1,000%. And so the question is, when we talk about the lagoon with all of its issues, we are literally saying that because there are so many issues, rather than talking about, oh, the seagrass is dying, the septic tanks, the manatees, the imbalance in the biodiversity and what's happening there, rather than bringing all of those issues up to the surface, we are literally going to think about the audience that we're presenting to, think about who it is that you're talking to, and decide what may be the thing that's most important to them. Maybe they don't have a septic tank, so they're not going to care to hear about that. But maybe they are, interested in seagrass, or maybe they are familiar with that. And so for that particular scenario, that would be a better story to tell based off the seagrass, portion of the 1,000 cuts that's happening with the lagoon. And so it's really important to understand your audience and know what they value, where they're coming from. Like I said, we're not going to go to Orlando and talk about an issue that will be irrelevant for them as compared to those here, who live on the barrier island, for instance. So that is a really tricky piece in communication, but it's something that we oftentimes lose sight of. And if we can be better at knowing who our audience is, knowing what they care about, coming to them on their level, then suddenly we make a much bigger impact. I'll tell you, we're working on the cruise ships. I have no idea what kind of people I'm addressing at first. And then over a couple of days, you're having meals with them and you're starting to understand where their backgrounds are, where they're coming from, how much they've traveled, why they're there. And suddenly I can, I switch my presentations a little bit to address them better, to connect with them better. Because on the surface at dinner, we may have nothing in common, but I know that at the end of the day, you like to sail, I like to sail. Let's talk about how we feel in the water. And that's, again, why that Blue Mind piece is really important, because conservation, the ecological benefits, economic benefits, those are important for different people. But I think overall, for all of us, we care about our well-being. And there's a lot of research, too, that shows that it's not just blue spaces, but it's actually healthy blue spaces that make us feel really good. And, I think we see that, too, with the lagoon for people who have lived here for so long and saw it blue, and now it's not so much. And a big thing that gets brought up is, how is that impacting our mental health? How is that impacting our well-being, especially for those populations, those people who have seen the change? Maybe you don't feel as good as you used to. But let's talk about how we used to feel and how we can get back to that.
Thank you. And how do you recommend coral reef scientists start their story?
People are dead and dying. Yeah, I will gauge my room, right? But I like to start with a story about diving. Not many people, those of you who are divers, know what it's like to be underwater, know that feeling of weightlessness. I mean, even for me, like my breathing changes when I'm underwater, becomes much slower. When you're underwater, you don't have very many other things to think about except for breathing. And so it makes you very present. And when I can actually describe that using story, I literally bring people underwater with me. And now they feel the same thing I feel when I'm looking at, these coral reefs in places like Cuba, where the coral reefs are beautiful and still very pristine and intact. And then I describe how I feel when I look at some of our coral reefs and, the Florida Reef Tract, how it's changed so much. And, it's a very big challenge. But, another thing to note too is that even as we're seeing these biological changes, these shifts, we want to put everything in categories, good, bad. But at the end of the day, nature is reacting to whatever the scenario is. It's going to adapt. It may not be good or bad for us, may not be good for us in the short term, but at the end of the day, we're going to be long gone and the planet is still going to exist. And so I just try to bring people down underwater with me through the stories that I share. And when you do that, it does create a level of connection that I think helps to bring about some more change. Yes.
Do you find a greater risk in oversimplification, or do you think that making a complex issue in compartments is a better approach?
Right. I think scientists seem to think that we are oversimplifying the issue when we start bringing it back to short, simple but significant. But that's the difference. It's simple, but it's significant. I think we muddy the waters when we bring in when we bring in too many issues. And so that's when we lose people. And so, we're not necessarily talking about dumbing it down in that sense, but it's just much more so of like making the issue much more manageable so that we can tackle that thing and we can feel empowered to address that one thing. And like I said, depending on your scenario where you are, that crowd will enjoy that. And then you can go to another part of the community and talk about a different aspect of what's happening. And in that way too, you get everybody on board, because at the end of the day, we're just trying to protect the lagoon. We're just trying to protect it. We can do it this way, but we need everybody to do something. And so as long as we're connecting with them in a way that resonates, I don't feel as though, I feel like we're doing communication a favor by making it simple but significant.
Yeah, I'd follow up on that same point. So my perspective is we have the 0.5-cent sales tax, and we're about 8 years into it. And one of the issues going forward is maintaining support. We had overwhelming support in the 2016 election. But there are people out there. So there are, say, 5 sort of fundamental thrusts within that plan: muck removal and septic to sewer and advanced septic and so on. There are people out there that are fixated on one solution or the other. They said, Jeff, if we just cut some more inlets, the problem would go away. Or if, we banned all septic tanks. And, I live in a nuanced world, right? So the challenge to try to put that discussion, right, there, it's all things, right? It's 1,000 cuts from 1,000 sources. We need, it's not really 1,000 solutions, but we need more than one solution. We need to fight this battle on multiple fronts. And so I'm having trouble putting that conversation into this context of how do you simplify it down, make it significant, and still capture the nuance that it's not just a single threat that we're dealing with.
Right. And again, why would I have no septic tank? That's not an issue that matters to me personally, because I don't have to make any changes to my world. So when we're talking about that thing, the end goal is, what is the change you need that person to make in order to get the results, a cleaner lagoon? So I think if we consider it more so in that regard, what is the change that person needs to make to improve the lagoon health? I think that can help.
I want the people that don't have a septic tank to support the notion of spending taxpayer dollars to remove septic tanks. That's basically what we're saying. It gets back to this, we have a common jewel here, right? We all share in the benefits of economic, environmental, and now this, I like the notion of emotional benefits. I mean, that's fundamentally, that's the story that
Yeah.
we've all, we're all in this canoe together, we've all got an oar in the water. Let's try to paddle in the same direction.
And I think, especially here on this planet, we are so good at putting one against the other. Well, it's your fault because you have the septic tank, so you need to go after it. And that, I think, is what's hindering us from coming up with better solutions or faster solutions in a sense, because we're so fixated on what the neighbor is doing that's wrong that we're not actually just coming together, no matter who you are, to make sure overall this is a big issue. And that's why I like showing that image of our planet from space. We're not planet Earth, we're planet ocean. And the astronauts who come back, when I've heard them interviewed, they all talk about that change in perspective of suddenly we are humans. How lucky are we to live on this planet that gives us life and oxygen? We no longer compartmentalize one another and point at the differences. And I think that's what slows us down, is we are just so fixed on how we're different rather than coming together to realize as a community. And, we're not even talking about a single county. This becomes that much more complicated because we stretch over 7 counties technically is what the watershed encompasses. And each one of those areas and people who live in those are using the lagoon differently and have their own issues. But when we understand that, we approach those communities differently. And when you can get them to understand how maybe they can improve one issue, then you can also then open up. Now their brains are open to the concept of, so you get that. Well, the septic tank is also a thing. So that's why we're, dealing with that. So I think it's just a matter of how do we first approach people? How do we bridge that gap, knock down the barrier, and all come together for that same unifying goal of restoring the lagoon? I hope that helps. It's just a matter of getting in.
Yes.
Sense.
Mhm. Mhm.
Can we have a round of applause, please, for our speaker? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
One more question.
Yes, please.
Define what Ola'pi is.
Ola'pi is the combination of my name, Paola, and then Pi is my husband's name. And then Ola, O-L-A, means wave in Spanish. So we're very water oriented. Thank you.
So what do you think of the efforts to